Good evening. I'm Paul Fredette.
And I'm Karen Fredette.
Together, Karen and I have been ministering to hermits and to religious solitaries around the world since 1997 through Ravensbread Ministries, right here from our home in the mountains of western North Carolina. And a wonderful thing happened, just a little over 6 months ago. We responded to a very gracious invitation from Brother Sean Bradley to participate in the efforts of the Interfaith Franciscan community by offering some regular presentations on the Doves for Peace channel. And it's been our real privilege throughout these last few months to be able to do that. We spent a good while in the spring and early part of the summer speaking about our ministry to hermits and religious solitaries and reflecting on that vocation, its features, and what are its challenges today in the 21st century. But before Karen and I began this ministry to hermits, Karen had spent over 30 years as a poor Clare nun in the monastery of Sancta Clara in Canton, Ohio. And during that time, she spent over 10 years researching the life and the times of the foundress of her order, that fascinating and inspiring woman, Clare of Assisi. The fruits of that research were borne out in 1984 with the publication of her book, Clare, Her Light, and Her Song, published by Franciscan Herald Press. This is a book that Karen brought out again just last year, had reprinted on the 800th anniversary of the founding of the Poor Clares, the second Franciscan order, who with the Friars Minor really make up the bulk of the Franciscan order. So a few weeks ago, Karen and I thought we would take this time together to share with you some of what her life and her times were, since she was not a woman who was only ahead of her own time, which she was. She's a woman very, very much who speaks to our time, a person of great faith, a person of great courage, and a person of great determination to hold on to the vision of the gospel that she had received from the Lord, and in large measure through her friend, her soul friend, and her mentor, Francis of Assisi. Karen?
Whenever we want to discuss a person who's done great things in their life, we have to look at where they came from. And one of the most prominent persons in Clare's life was her mother, Ortolana. Ortolana is an Italian name which means the good gardener, and Clare was the little plant. Her mother came from a noble family of Assisi, as was attested by Clare's first biographer, Thomas of Celano. His book has been recently, his Legend of Clare, as it was called in those days, has recently been retranslated and brought out for anybody who's interested. But in that book, Lady Ortolana is described as a woman of great courage, for she undertook things that were rarely done by women in her time. She was married to another noble of Assisi, Fervaroni de Offerduccio, a large family. There were 5 brothers as of her husband, and they formed a major clan in the city life. After Ortolana's marriage, she did she made 3 pilgrimages that were known in those days as Deus, Angelus, et Homo, God, angels, and men, because she went to 3 major pilgrimage sites. First, she went to the distant sanctuary down in Apulia called St. Michael on Monte Gargano. So that was the angel part of the
Mm-hmm.
pilgrimage. Then she made a pilgrimage to Rome to visit the sites where the apostles were buried and had started their ministry in the Roman world. And thirdly, and most astonishing, she traveled to the Holy Land in order to see the place where, quote, God himself walked on this earth.
We're going to take some time in our presentation this evening to really consider uh, Ortolana's pilgrimages, especially this major pilgrimage to the Holy Land. We'd like you all with us this evening as we reflect on this to kind of consider what a pilgrimage like this would have involved for a person, the preparation for that, and the risks involved, the liabilities involved in doing this. I mean, just think of ourselves today and all that all that we do and all that preoccupies our mind when we're preparing for an overseas trip, and all of the things that are at our disposal. I mean, we have electronic ticketing to book our passage. We have luggage handlers. We have, in other countries, if we run into problems, we have the consulate, usually of our own nation, that we can go to for help. There are all kinds of facilities, all kinds of agencies, and the world in terms of security, while we may view it today as a rather dangerous place with the threats of terrorism and whatever, well, it was a far, far riskier and more dangerous place then. And many people who undertook pilgrimages really did not know whether they would ever return, and
Yeah.
were encouraged to have all of their affairs in order, both familially, religiously, spiritually, economically, in every way. So as we move through this section of Karen's research, we invite you to just reflect, and perhaps some of you have made pilgrimages yourself and so can kind of reconnect with that experience as we move through this reflection this evening.
The reason that we're spending some time on looking at Ortolana was brought out by Thomas of Celano when he said, by the fruit the tree is known, the fruit being Chiara, Clare, and because of the tree, the fruit is praised. Chiara already had a good reputation because of her mother. And it's said that he wrote in his own poetic style, the abundance of divine favor preceded in the root, that in its little branch a wealth of holiness might follow. So by understanding Ortolana better, we will get an insight into how Clare became the woman she became.
Mm-hmm. Well, she undertook this pilgrimage to the Holy Land for reasons,
Ortolana.
yeah, Ortolana did, for reasons of prayer and devotion, um, it would have been, for any other reason, absolutely unthinkable and foolhardy for a woman, even a woman of her status, to be uh, thinking at all about traveling on her own that way. It could be. There is some evidence to suggest that her husband, uh, Favaroni, was off on the Crusades and may have communicated with her that it was safe at that point, that the successful conclusion of the crusade, the Third Crusade, um, this would have been about the year 1182. We have this kind of interesting medieval print, this color print that shows both the Pope and the Pilgrims and the Crusaders all in one swell foop, as they say. Um, but these this was a very anxious time and still a very, very risky time, even though passage to the Holy Land was open. The Crusaders had conquered St. John of Acre by force of arms, and so had opened the passages uh, for travel. But the control of Palestine was still largely in the hands of the Saracens. Now, it's not really, any details are given about Ortolana's pilgrimage. The details of the trip would not really be all that difficult to reconstruct. One of the other medieval prints we have here shows a typical galley of the time that would have transported both Crusaders and Pilgrims. This one happens to be transporting both. Uh, and they were rather rickety and cramped and small affairs, and the passage would not have been easy. Uh, to undertake a voyage like this, leaving from a port in Italy and traveling through the Aegean down to the Mediterranean, and making that trip over to the coast of the Holy Land, you had to really, as I said, put your affairs in order. You had to leave somebody in charge of your household. You had to make sure that all your debts were paid. You had to leave somebody in charge of your holdings, your land holdings, if you had a household. And usually the ship captains demanded payment in advance because they could never be sure that a returning pilgrim would actually be returning. So pilgrim ships, as well as crusader vessels, had to take advantage of the best seasons for sailing, often leaving commercial ports like Venice in the late spring, and hoping to return before the winter storms began in November. Really, the hardships were grim to those who were hardy enough to brave the seas. Not only the length of time that they spent aboard rolling in those cramped ships, but also not the best of provisions, and the lack of fresh water and the primitive state of sanitation. Usually people just steered them, steeled themselves, and Ortolana must have done the same by remembering the special blessings and ceremonies that accompanied the departing pilgrims, that she probably experienced at a farewell ceremony, a farewell mass, most likely in the Cathedral of San Rufino. Although the Crusaders were, in a broad sense, also pilgrims, the traditional pilgrim spirit, so to speak, was somewhat deflected um, in their case from its original character. I mean, they were reputed to be men of faith, and they were undertaking the Crusades as a means of faith as well. But these were very, very violent times, and these were knights, and they were bent on exterminating the Saracens, not negotiating with them. Whenever negotiations replaced extermination, this was sort of a letdown for the soldiers who were sort of, in many ways, glorified and sanctified mercenaries
Yes.
of their respective dukes, princes, and kings. Karen?
Well, we can probably guess from what information we do have that Lady Ortolana's pilgrimage most likely took place before she had any children. Her first child was born in 1194. That would have been Chiara. So perhaps her husband sent her word that in 1192 the passage to Jerusalem was open to pilgrimages. And we know we can make this an educated guess, again, because Thomas of Celano wrote of Ortolana that although she was bound by marriage ties and burdened with the cares of a household, she made this pilgrimage. And then he says, and when she at length returned, with great joy, no doubt, she finally gave birth to a child. So we might wonder, because people often made a vow to make a pilgrimage, or they had a petition to make. And it's possible that Ortolana's petition was to bear children.
And to bear them safely, to
And,
come through childbirth safely.
right. So knights and their company wore the cross conspicuously on their clothing, as Paul is showing us, while the penitential garb of a pilgrim would have been a broad-brimmed hat, a wallet slung across one's body, across the back, and a staff. And if possible, it would have been iron-tipped, not only to make it a safer staff, but to serve as protection as needed.
We have a couple of prints here that show, here's another medieval color print that actually shows a group of pilgrims, and here's the pilgrim with the traditional broad-brimmed hat and wallet coming to a pilgrim place of rest. Here would be what a medieval female pilgrim would have resembled this, and so we might look at this garb and this modeling of medieval woman's pilgrim clothing attire as a pretty good indication of what Ortolana may have looked like at the time.
What she would have worn, yes. In that wallet that she carried around her body at all times would have been the letter from the bishop, which attested that she was a genuine pilgrim and not just a robber or a pilgrim profiteer who was going to make money.
Or something even worse.
Yes. But she had to prove what she was. She also had to carry with her all her needs, a mattress and blankets and a barrel of wine, barrel of water, and dried meat and bread, because food, the provisions on the ships were very, very monotonous if they were there at all.
So she would have had several attendants with her.
Yeah, well, they would have been traveling in a group, and possibly a group from Assisi. Thomas of Celano mentions her kinswoman Bona Gualfuccio as having traveled with her and made these pilgrimages. And once they were on a galley, the women probably were given a place below decks. Men slept on the decks, spread their
Mm-hmm.
bedrolls as they were on the decks. Below decks wasn't much either. They
Mm-hmm.
were shelves, as they were, about 18 inches wide, nailed to the walls of the galley, and generally often not long enough for a person to even stretch out.
Oh, wow.
And when the ship would be rolling, I think the people who spread their mattresses on the floor were probably safer because they didn't suffer the risk of being thrown off
Mm-hmm.
the um, the berth.
By the way, this image is a statue that, and I've tried to actually locate the place where this statue is, but obviously a statue erected in honor of and in commemoration of medieval pilgrims in Europe. It is European. It may actually be in Italy. I'm not exactly sure. I'm certainly not going to go on record as saying it is in Italy. I suspect it is. I stand to be corrected on that, but it is a rather recent sculpture and apparently one that is often visited by tourists today and maybe even by modern day pilgrims as well. But it certainly captures the sense and the look of the medieval pilgrim as he and she were.
Yeah, that um, the other thing about traveling on board a galley was that they were subject to the harassment of marauding ships of the infidels, who were more than happy to capture them and then sell the Christians as slaves in the
Mm-hmm.
markets of the East. So pilgrim and crusader ships alike um, were under attack at all times. The the crusaders on board would hang their shields along the outside of the galleys to let anyone know that there were armed men on board and there would be a fight if the ship were boarded. And they could only stop at ports along the route that were in Christian hands. Access to Palestine frequently was safest by way of Egypt. So after passing Cyprus, the ships would put in at St. John of Acre.
Right, which is actually in northern Israel. They would put in there, but rather than go overland to the shrines, then they would oftentimes, after putting in there at St. John of Acre in on the northern coast of Israel, what is Israel today,
Palestine.
Palestine, they would then take other ships and they would actually proceed to the port in Egypt of Damietta. And this is actually a painting, if you will, an illustration of the actual port of Damietta being captured. I believe it's an 18th or 19th century painting of the port of Damietta in Egypt being taken by the Crusaders' fleet. Um, Today, it's a far more tranquil view. This is the concourse at the port of Damietta as it looks today. Um, so, setting out from Egypt, uh, the, the pilgrims would have gone overland through the Negev, and they would have been accompanied and probably protected somewhat um, by the Crusaders um, who traveled along with them on horseback. And when at last they came to Jerusalem, the longed-for city, appearing white and glistening in the distance, they would do as pious Jews had done for centuries. They would dismount on the height of joy, the Mons Gaudii, to sing the traditional pilgrim song of joyous thanksgiving. Before being received at one of the traditional places for pilgrims to lodge, like this, which is would have been the lodging place of the Knights Hospitallers of St. John. This is the entrance to their museum in Valletta at this point. But the psalm that they would have sung would have been that traditional song, the Song of Ascent. And maybe we could just take a moment and prayerfully listen to it together. I was glad when they said to me, "Let us go to the house of the Lord." Our feet are standing within your gates, O Jerusalem. Jerusalem, built as a city that is firmly bound together. To it the tribes go up, the tribes of the Lord, as was decreed for Israel, to give thanks to the name of the Lord. For there the thrones for judgment were set up, the thrones of the house of David. So pray for the peace of Jerusalem. May they prosper who love you. Peace be within your walls, and security within your towers. For the sake of my relatives and friends, I will say, peace be within you. For the sake of the house of the Lord, our God, I will seek your good. How appropriate, how beautiful.
That was Psalm 122. And no doubt the prayer for peace, especially in Jerusalem, was very fervent.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So the pilgrims would have put in at the Knights of the Holy Sepulchre, or one of the hostelries that had been provided for the recently founded variety of confraternities whose purpose was to assist pilgrims now that the way was open for the resumption of pilgrimages. And maybe they were even welcomed. They might have even been welcomed by the members of the Alto Passio, a confraternity that had been founded by their own countrymen from neighboring Tuscany, which is the area just to the northeast of Umbria. Once in Jerusalem, of course, the pilgrims would have sought out what we know and call today as the Via Dolorosa, the Way of the Cross, which begins at the sites that were associated with Herod's palace and the governor's palace, the palace or the headquarters of Pontius Pilate, and where Jesus would have been given the crossbeam to carry along with the others who were to be executed with him, and meandered out that distance through the western end of the city, where the hill was, where they did the public executions. So over there at that hill, at the time that Ortolana made her pilgrimage, stood the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. It was one of the holiest places in Jerusalem, and this is even what it looks like today, but it pretty much looked like that even then. They had erected a Romanesque church on the spots which had united really three older desecrated shrines. those of a small shrine over of the resurrection, and then one that had been a shrine on the rock of the crucifixion, and then the other had been a crypt that had been attributed to the finding of the true cross, the Holy Cross. So Ortolana and her companions would have entered through the double doors of the main building, which you see on your screen. We have another example of that shows the whole courtyard a little bit better. Um, she would have gone through those double doors, and although they're impressively wide, they're deliberately low, so as to prevent men on horseback, men at arms on horseback, from riding through with the intention of either sacrilege or pillage. Immediately to their right would have been the reputed site of Calvary, though very little of the rock itself was still there. And some distance to the left there would have been a graceful rotunda which covered the Holy Sepulchre itself, and a crypt reached by descending stairs from the main building contained the subterranean sanctuary that was dedicated to Saint Helena, as you might well remember, the mother of the Emperor Constantine, who was credited with being the actual finder of the true cross of Christ. When Our Lady Ortolana and her fellow travelers visited the shrine, however, the wood of the cross wasn't there. It had fallen into the hands of the Saracens when they had defeated the Christian army defending the Jerusalem in 1187, and the treaty which followed the Fifth Crusade, which at this time had not even happened yet, had stipulated the return of these Christian relics, but that really never happened. From there, Ortolana most likely would have visited what is known as the Cenacle. It is a church built at the really one of the highest spots in Jerusalem, the ancient Rock of David. And there was a church that had been built there at the site of what had been the Last Supper. And it's a splendid basilica, and it was also erected by the Crusaders themselves. And it really gave entrance on it was adjoining actually the place of the upper room that had been venerated since the earliest days of Christianity as the place where Jesus
celebrated
the Last Supper with his disciples. Maybe, though, we don't really know, but maybe the spot that really captured the interest and most stirred Ortolana was Gethsemane, where the gnarled olive trees seemed ancient enough to be the very ones which had witnessed the Savior's most anxious hours. Here, at least, one could feel that one saw the same things with Jesus himself had seen, which one could not say at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre or the Cenacle or many of the other shrines there in Jerusalem. Here, there was even the aura of agony seemed to linger about the gray-white rocks that were shadowed by all of these bent trees. All-night vigils were common in these places, so perhaps Ortolana spent the dark hours of a night at prayer among these very twisted trees.
Ortolana had made this trip to come closer to her Savior, but she also stored everything she experienced in her memory. And I'd like to share with you the words of Saint Jerome, who also had made a pilgrimage way back in the 3rd century or so, and gave a reason for doing this. He said, "Just as one understands the Greek historians better when one has seen Athens, so we understand the scriptures
Mm-hmm.
that much better when we have seen Judea with our own eyes and discovered what still remains of the ancient towns. That is why I myself took care to travel through this land. While Ortolana was there, she would not have passed up the chance to go to Bethlehem and visited the church that was set up over the reputed site of the birth of Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
And again, with Jerome, she would have been seeking something more than just that site, but a city which one already knows in one's mind from having read about it in Holy Scripture. And she would have gone into the cave that they claimed was the site of the birth.
Mm-hmm.
And I know when I was writing my book, I had used my imagination a great deal to write this book. And I can understand when I finally got to Assisi,
Mm-hmm.
what a thrill it was to see these places
Mm-hmm.
where I had dwelt in memory, in
Mm-hmm.
imagination. So this would have been Ortolana's similar
Experience
experience.
as well, right?
Yes. But she returned home with, no doubt, great joy and relief that she had done it safely. And she would have brought with her the emblem of a bona fide pilgrim, which was a palm branch from Jericho, one of the final places that
Mm-hmm.
she would have visited. And that's why they were given the name of Palmer, which was endured up and through the 1900s, early 20th century even.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But she was still restless. She hadn't really satisfied the desires of her heart. But she did achieve her possible goal when she returned to her home on the piazza
Mm-hmm.
in Assisi, a home that adjoined the Cathedral of San Rufino.
In this picture over here that we're showing you on the screen, the center is the facade, the front of the Cathedral of San Rufino, with the door right here. And it's this area right here to your left, to the left of the facade, that constitutes what had been considered at the time the palazzo of the Favaronis. So this would have been Clare's actual home. So you can see how close it was to the church itself. I kind of kidded with Karen and I said maybe they had a special door that went in the back somewhere that led on to the church itself, so they never even had to come outside to go into the church. And Karen smiled, but she neither denied nor confirmed that such a door or opening existed.
Well, at least it wasn't shown to us when I was there in Assisi with my fellow pilgrims. But Ortolana was afraid, even more afraid, during her pregnancy, because women frequently died in childbirth, or the babies died either shortly afterwards. The women had many children, and their bodies were torn up by it, in order with the hope that at least a few would reach adulthood. So we do know that Ortolana was praying before the crucifix, quite likely one in the Cathedral of San Rufino. And while she was praying there, she, like Francis, heard a voice within her which said, "Fear not, woman, for you shall bring forth without danger a light which shall greatly illumine the world."
Echoes from the scriptures.
Yes?
Yes.
How so?
Well, it sounds an awful lot to me. It's very reminiscent of the phrases chosen in St. Luke. And I think Thomas of Celano even brought that out. but it's very reminiscent of Hail Mary, full of grace. Do not be afraid, Mary. You have found favor with God. And even the words of the prophet Simeon when the child Jesus was brought to the temple, um, he is destined to be a light to the nations, you know. So, whether or not it was Thomas of Celano who embellished this, or whether or not these were the actual words of Ortolana's vision, apparently they moved her very much that her child would be very special.
Yes, and to honor this, she named her daughter Chiara, or light, or Clare, which means bright one,
Mm-hmm.
light, so that she would always remember this promise, which proved true.
Mm-hmm.
She had at least two more children who reached adulthood, both girls. One was Catherine, close in age to Clare, but she's known to history mainly by her name and religion, which was Agnes. And then they had a younger sister, Beatrice.
Mm-hmm.
So at least.
Now, both Agnes and Beatrice eventually joined Clare at the monastery at San
They
Giovanni.
did, but
Okay.
let's not jump ahead. Let's
Oh,
let
okay.
them
All right.
guess this is what
Okay.
will happen. At the moment, we have three lively little girls that Ortolana is trying to bring up. Apparently, her husband was not home very often.
Mm-hmm.
He must have been home sometimes, but
Yeah.
he was gone so frequently that one of the people who was interviewed after Claire's death,
Mm-hmm.
but had lived across this piazza, claims that she actually never met Favaroni.
Oh my.
So this left Ortolana
And this in a time when everybody in the neighborhood not only knew everybody, but they knew about everybody's business. So
yes,
if she didn't know him and had never met him, he couldn't have been home very often.
that's my conclusion. So that left Ortolana taking care of this major household with all its staff. Also, they had estates in the countryside from which they raised their food,
Mm-hmm.
grapes,
So
wheat,
they would have had vineyards and
vineyards. They had a summer residence.
so that would they
They
have
have
had
olive groves.
yeah, would they have had tenants that would have been working these country estates
Oh
for
yeah,
them? Yeah.
oh yeah. And
Okay.
again, Ortolana had to look after them. She also would have been very aware of the beggars within her city, many of which took their place on the steps of the cathedrals, which, as we see, are just outside the front
Yeah.
door of her own home.
Yeah, it would have been pretty hard to avoid them.
Well, yes, and she was.
But it was still possible to ignore them. And
Well, I guess many tried, but
what we're saying is that she did not ignore the poor. There's an interesting medieval print of beggars in the square before the big church that probably would have been a scene that Ortolana would have known all too well.
yes, she was been very familiar, and according to Thomas of Celano, she was known for her generosity to the poor, providing them with food, herbs, and clothing. And this is a picture of a medieval woman giving a cloak to a needy person. Clare probably accompanied her mother on many of these um, things of charity that her mother uh, took part in. And she also would have walked with her mother through the city in the afternoons after siesta, visiting the various churches, especially on feast days. Perhaps on a Marian feast, they would have slipped through the Corinthian columns of a ancient ancient building on the main Piazza Comune, the main cathedral,
which is the picture you see in front of you right now, is the Piazza Comune of Assisi itself. And in the distance, on the left-hand side of the screen, you can see this one great tower, and right next to it, you can see those same Corinthian columns. This is well, Karen will tell
Well,
you.
in the first century, when the Romans took over, they erected a church in honor of the goddess Minerva. And the church itself suffered a conversion when Assisi became Christian during the 3rd century. And so they renamed it Santa Maria sopra Minerva, Mary, Holy Mary above Minerva.
Right.
There was another cathedral dedicated to Mary in the city, Santa Maria Maggiore, the major church of Mary. There was the Church of San Pietro. I have seen all of these. They're still standing. And the Church of San Giorgio, which was on a level below the Piazza Comune. And that church would have been the parish church of Francis' family.
Ah.
And the Latin school was located there. So that would have been where Francis would have learned to read and write.
Mm-hmm.
And so Clare would have wandered through the city with her mother, never alone, always chaperoned. And perhaps they even went outside the walls to the ruined chapel of San Damiano.
Mm-hmm.
It's a guess, but it's a possibility.
Mm-hmm.
So this gives you some idea of Clare's family and what it was like as she was growing up. We would like now to share a song with you, again written by a poor Clare, Sister Briege O'Hare in Ireland, and she based it on the words from the John's Gospel, chapter 16, verses 21 to 23. It's on a CD named Creation Waits, and it is sung by Marie Cox. It is entitled When a Woman is Giving Birth. And we thought that it was a wonderful tribute to Ortolana and the thoughts that would have been in her mind and heart at the time.
We've printed the words for it so that you can follow along, because sometimes it's difficult to catch all the lyrics. But it's a beautiful meditation on the joy that comes on giving birth. And we imagine, as Karen and I listened to it, that it would have represented the sentiments very much of Ortolana herself, the mother of Clare.
As Paul says, we will put the words up for you to watch this. Yes.
One moment while we just try to find this over here. We had it, and I think we
kind of lost it a bit, but it's coming. Do be patient with us. Give the words now, honey.
Here it is.
Giving birth to her child, suffers because her time has come. A woman giving birth to her child, is born. Like a woman giving birth to her child. So now it is the same with you. Like a woman giving birth to her child. You suffer in giving birth to me. But when at last you see my face, you forget all your pain. Only joy fills your heart. Joy fills your heart. Joy fills your heart. That I've come to you. Then ask for anything. Yes, ask for anything. Ask for my Father's love to complete your joy. To complete your joy.
That's such a prayerful song, isn't it, dear?
It is. It is, and as I listened to it just now again, I couldn't think of anything more appropriate, because it is for all of us. If we take our journey, our own pilgrimage towards the holy, which is our life, and in some ways, Ortolana's pilgrimage is a paradigm of her whole life, as it was the life of Clare, as it was the life of Francis, and it is meant to be our own life as well. That pilgrimage that is our life, that we're not just here going through this life sort of as tourists, or we can, but really our vocation is to go through life as pilgrims on our way to that sacred shrine which is God himself, which is the Holy of Holies, which we find all the time that we are carrying in ourselves. And this whole experience, this whole call of giving birth to the holy in our world, this incarnational experience, echoes the very sentiments of this song, and which I find so completely appropriate for today, and well, actually for every day.
There's a book that was brought out a number of years ago by Father Edward Hayes, which is called Planetary Pilgrim. It's a wonderful book, and in it, he not only has a series of marvelous prayers, at the end, he tells how we can be pilgrims, and that the journey that most of us have to make is the journey within. Even someone like Lady Ortolana, who went to the Holy Land, still had this further journey to make within. And one of the things that we need to do is to learn more how to pray, how to be focused when we pray. And Father Edward Hayes gives us a few very simple steps to help us become focused and centered.
Mm-hmm.
The first thing he suggests is that we sit still and quiet our body. He says this is the first requirement for any journey inward, to quiet our body, which so easily absorbs countless energies of life that surround us. But without straining, we're intended to sit quietly, gently, and then with just gentleness, begin to breathe deeply. Just be conscious of our act of breathing. Don't change it, just feel it. Feel the breath going in and out, in and out, and naturally it will quiet down. We will become more relaxed. You'll feel the relaxation flow through your entire body. And in short, we will begin to think of breathing out all that disturbs us, all the darkness within. And each breath is bringing in clean, fresh air, which is God's light, God's life. With each breath, imagine the air within us growing lighter, more luminous, until you are feel that you are filled with light and peace. Then, having prepared ourselves, we rest in that peace. He asks us to practice just sitting in stillness, absorbed in this peace. And we may be able to do that only briefly. But then when other thoughts come, just return. Use our consciousness of our breathing to once again return to that peace, which will open us. And as we go inward, choose a word that speaks to us, a sacred word which we can then repeat, which will allow us to be centered. It can be a word like love, peace, Yeshua, Jesus, compassion, any word that speaks to our heart. And so we suggest that in the coming week, you practice this.
We want to leave you again this evening with Clare's blessing. We want to thank you for joining with us, and I want to remind you that if you want to avail yourselves of obtaining Clare's book, or Karen's book on Clare, Clare, Her Light and Her Song, that can be obtained by going to our website, ravensbreadministries.com, and you can order it from there. Once again, thank you for joining with us this evening. And now we'd like to pray God's own blessing in the words of St. Clare for you. Always be lovers of God and your souls and the souls of your sisters and brothers, and always be eager to observe what you have promised the Lord. May the Lord be with you always, and wherever you are, may you be with him always. Amen. God bless you all, and good night.
God be with you.